So today's episode of Writing Notes is going to focus on a specific structure for an essay. This is what we in the business call the 5-paragraph essay model. This is a bad structure to use. Now, that's a complicated statement to make. It's not bad in and of itself. So, structurally, there's nothing wrong with it. Officially, there's nothing wrong with it in terms of the way that the argument moves or is set up. The problem is it looks like a high school essay. So, this is one of those paper structures that's really easy to think of spatially. So here's what it looks like spatially. So we've got what are called triangle introductions and triangle conclusions. And I'll talk a bit more about what those specifically involve in just a second. And then you've got 3 main chunks of the paper. Now, part of the problem with the 5-paragraph essay model is that each of these chunks is its own separate thing. So part of the problem with this structure is that it leads to really disconnected papers. So, there's a couple of things I want to say specifically about the 5-paragraph essay structure, things that you want to avoid. First off, the triangle introduction. This is a bad technique because it sounds very basic. So basically what the triangle introduction asks you to do, and this works the same way for the triangle conclusion, just reverse order, is you start out very broad. So we have a joke among teachers, a sort of joke introduction. There are a couple of different versions of this. My favorite is, in the modern world of today in which we live. But this opening sentence, and the opening sentences are tough, and I'm going to give you guys a video on introductions at some point that will give you guys some more ideas about those. But the problem with the triangle approach is that it starts out very broad. So it's in society today, or throughout history, across time, since the invention of whatever it is. So it makes these very broad, sweeping generalizations about history, or about culture, or about society, about art, politics, whatever it is. It doesn't add much rhetorically to your paper. There's an argument that it maybe starts to get us into the context of the paper, but it's not the best way to do it. Then you get slightly more specific as you move down the triangle. So you might start out with, throughout the history of education, students have been asked to learn about writing. And you move down. Writing is something that has changed dramatically in the 20th and 21st centuries. So still very broad, still not very useful. And then you get to your thesis. And you may want to check out my video on thesis statements for more information about a thesis. But the thesis is the central claim that the paper is trying to make. And usually the way that a thesis is structured for a 5-paragraph essay is very formulaic. Because again, you've got this formulaic structure. So usually the way that a thesis works for a 5-paragraph essay is, this is my claim because X, Y, and Z. So usually what you have is you have the sort of argument that you want to make, and then 3 main points. Which is not necessarily a bad structure in and of itself. And the problem becomes you get to these 3 sections, each section of which ends up being disconnected, each section of which tries to prove its own point. So, section 1 in this argument about writing changing in the 21st century might be the advancement of technology. So we have now digital composition, we have typing as opposed to handwriting, and so on and so on. Section 2 might be the democratization of education. We suddenly have more people going to university, more people finishing high school than we've ever had at any time in history. Section 3 might be that the structures for writing, the structures for composition, argumentation, diction, and so on have been have become less formal. So we're more comfortable with informal speech, with slang, with irony and sarcasm and things like this in composition classrooms today than we were maybe 100, 150 years ago. Each of these three things may be true, each of these things may be important to the argument that's being made. The problem becomes that they don't necessarily connect to one another, that they're just 3 points that become chunks of the paper. And you can put a transition between them. But what you really want with a well-structured paper, you want a paper where every idea builds on the ideas that have come before it. And if you have 3 distinct ideas that aren't building on top of one another, the logic of the paper doesn't really work. And then again, you hit your triangle conclusion, you go back, you restate the thesis, and then you broaden it back out. And instead of broadening it out to the same point that you started at the introduction, you broaden it out to, here's how these things that I've said affect everything in the world today. Again, you want to avoid this structure primarily because it looks juvenile. This structure, because it's a structure that gets taught a lot in high schools, because it's a very basic form of writing, a very basic form of structuring an argument, it gets taught to beginning writers, and then the idea implicitly, although this is perhaps rarely stated, the idea becomes that you take this model and then you build on it. You expand it and you make it more complex. So that's really what you want to do if you want to start from a 5-paragraph essay model. So you don't want to end with a 5-paragraph essay model. If you start from this place, if you start from this structure, you want to make it more complex, you really want to make it your own. Thank you.